For 7 years, I paid my parents' bills without ever asking what would happen to the house when they were gone. It wasn't something I thought about much. In my mind, helping them was just what you did for family. When the mortgage fell behind, I sent money. When the air conditioner broke in the middle of a Texas summer, I covered the repair. Groceries, utilities, property tax. If something needed to be handled, I handled it. And I never imagined that one afternoon, while helping my father organize paperwork at their kitchen table, I would stumble across a document that made all of it look very different. My name is Lauren Whitaker. I'm 33 years old and I live in Plano, Texas, about 15 minutes from the house where my parents raised my sister and me. The day everything changed was a Sunday in early April. My father, Thomas Whitaker, had asked me to come over because he needed help scanning some documents for his records. He'd never been comfortable with computers, and my mother, Deborah, avoided anything involving paperwork whenever possible. So I drove over after lunch the way I had hundreds of times before. Their house looked the same as it always had, the same brick driveway, the same oak tree in the front yard that had been there since I was a kid. Inside, the kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and lemon cleaner. Nothing about the day felt unusual. Dad brought out a stack of papers and set them beside the scanner I'd brought with me. "Just need digital copies," he said casually. "Insurance stuff, tax things, that sort of thing." I started working through the pile one document at a time: utility records, insurance forms, old tax returns, routine paperwork. About halfway through the stack, I noticed a thicker folder mixed in with the others, dark blue, slightly worn along the edges. Across the tab in clean printed letters were two words: estate plan. At first, I assumed it had been placed there by accident. I hesitated, my hand resting on the folder. I'm not someone who goes digging through other people's private documents, but standing there in my parents' kitchen after years of helping keep that house running, curiosity crept in before I could talk myself out of it. I opened the folder. Inside were several pages of neatly organized legal documents, typed paragraphs, signatures, official stamps. It didn't take long to understand what I was looking at. My parents' will. I scanned the first page quickly, not really processing anything yet. Then I slowed down, looking for something specific. My name, Lauren Whitaker. I expected to see it somewhere near the beginning, maybe next to the house, maybe beside a savings account or a property listing. Instead, I found something else: the house in Plano, the savings accounts, every listed asset. All of it was designated to one person, Chloe Whitaker, my younger sister. I kept reading, certain I had missed something. Eventually, I did find my name, but only once. A single line buried deep in the document that mentioned both daughters in a vague sentence about love and appreciation. Nothing more. No inheritance, no property, no share of the house, just a sentence. I stood there in the quiet kitchen, holding the papers, suddenly aware of the faint hum of the refrigerator behind me. My mind didn't go to anger right away. It went somewhere else first, to the small notebook sitting in my purse, the one where I kept track of things I paid for when my parents fell behind: mortgage payments, utility bills, repairs, 7 years' worth of numbers written in my own handwriting. For the first time, a question formed in my head that had never occurred to me before. If the house was always meant to be Chloe's, then what exactly had I been paying for all these years? I closed the folder slowly and placed it back on the table exactly where I had found it. Across the room, I heard my father's footsteps coming down the hallway, and suddenly I realized something that made my chest feel strangely hollow. I had been helping hold that house together for years, but I had no idea what place, if any, I didn't say anything about the will that Sunday afternoon. Instead, I finished scanning the rest of the papers like nothing had happened. Dad thanked me the way he always did, with a quick nod and a distracted smile, before stacking the documents back into their folders. Mom was in the living room watching a home renovation show, occasionally calling out comments about kitchens and countertops like she might one day redo ours. Everything looked normal, which somehow made what I had just read feel even stranger. Later that evening, after I drove back to my apartment in Plano, I pulled the small notebook out of my purse and set it on the kitchen counter. It wasn't anything fancy, just a spiral notebook I'd started keeping years earlier when my parents first ran into financial trouble. At the time, I hadn't thought of it as tracking anything important. It was just a way to remember what had been paid and what still needed attention. But as I flipped through the pages that night, the entries told a story I had never fully stepped back to see. 7 years earlier, my parents had almost fallen behind on the mortgage for the first time. Dad had been between jobs then, and Mom's part-time income at a local church office wasn't enough to cover everything. I had just started working as an operations manager at a dental clinic outside Dallas. I wasn't making a fortune, but I had a steady paycheck and fewer expenses than they did. Helping out had felt like the obvious thing to do. The first entry in the notebook was simple: mortgage payment March, a number written beside it. After that came more: utilities during a winter when the heating bill spiked, a roof repair after a storm blew shingles off the back side of the house, a new water heater when the old one finally gave out, groceries a few times when Mom mentioned they were trying to stretch their budget until the end of the month. Page after page of small decisions that had seemed normal at the time. What I noticed most as I read through it was how rarely anyone had asked. Most of the time, I had offered. If Dad mentioned the air conditioner wasn't working right, I'd say I can take care of that. If Mom sounded worried about bills, I'd tell her not to stress and send money later that evening. It had never felt like sacrifice. It had felt like responsibility. My younger sister, Chloe, had still been living at home through most of those years. She was 4 years younger than me and had always moved through life at a slower pace. Different jobs came and went: retail stores, a coffee shop, a few months helping a friend with a small online business. Nothing that stuck long enough to build real stability. My parents always explained it the same way. Chloe just needs time, Mom would say. And I believed her. Looking back at the notebook that night, I realized something else. Not once in those 7 years had anyone talked about what the future of the house might look like, who would eventually take care of it, who might inherit it. It had never come up in conversation. The arrangement had simply settled into place over time without anyone really discussing it. I closed the notebook and rested my hand on the cover for a moment. At the time, helping my parents had felt like building something solid for the whole family, like keeping the ground steady under all of us. But now, after seeing the estate plan that afternoon, a quiet thought lingered in the back of my mind. Maybe the ground had never belonged to all of us in the first place. The next time I went to my parents' house was 3 days later on a Wednesday evening. I hadn't planned to bring up the will right away. For most of the drive over, I told myself I might have misunderstood something in the documents. Estate papers could be complicated. Maybe I had read it too quickly. Maybe there was another page I hadn't seen. That possibility sat quietly in my mind as I parked in the driveway. The porch light was already on. Through the front window, I could see my mother moving around the kitchen. Everything looked exactly the same as it had on Sunday. When I stepped inside, Mom greeted me with the same easy warmth she always had. "Lauren, you're just in time," she said. "Your dad's trying to fix the garbage disposal again." From the kitchen sink, Dad muttered something that sounded suspiciously like a complaint about plumbing. For a few minutes, the evening unfolded in the familiar rhythm I had known my entire adult life. Dad fiddled with tools under the sink. Mom poured iced tea and talked about the neighbor down the street who had just replaced their fence. Nothing about the scene suggested that anything important had changed, but the blue estate folder kept replaying in my mind. Eventually, when Dad finished with the disposal and wiped his hands on a dish towel, I asked the question that had been sitting in my chest since Sunday. "I saw the estate paperwork the other day," I said. The room grew still in a way that felt small but noticeable. Dad looked up from the counter. Mom paused with the pitcher of tea halfway to the glass. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "I didn't mean to go through anything private," I added calmly. "It was in the stack you asked me to scan." Dad cleared his throat. "Oh," he said. "That." His tone carried the same casual weight someone might use when talking about renewing an insurance policy. "I just noticed something," I continued, "about the house." Dad shifted slightly, glancing toward Mom. "It's complicated," he said after a second. The answer came too quickly to feel thoughtful. "Complicated how I asked." Mom set the pitcher down carefully on the counter before turning toward me. Lauren, she said gently, you know you're doing well for yourself. The comment seemed unrelated at first. You've always been responsible, she continued. You have a good job. You're stable. She spoke like someone explaining a practical decision rather than a painful one. Chloe has a harder time finding her footing, she said. We just want to make sure she's taken care of. The words hung in the air between us. Not defensive, not apologetic, just matter of fact. Dad nodded once beside her. That's really all there is to it. I looked from one of them to the other. The explanation didn't feel angry or confrontational. It felt settled, as if the decision had been made a long time ago, and everyone assumed it would make sense once I heard it. You mean the house goes to Chloe? I said quietly. Mom gave a small, reassuring smile. Well, eventually, yes. Her tone suggested the arrangement was reasonable, logical, something any sensible person would understand. I felt the memory of my notebook pressing quietly against the inside of my purse. 7 years of mortgage payments, repairs, groceries, small emergencies that had slowly become routine. None of those numbers seemed to fit naturally with what I was hearing, but no one in the room seemed to think that part mattered. You're independent, Mom added almost kindly. You don't really need help the way Chloe might. Dad nodded again as if that closed the conversation. I stood there in the same kitchen where I had spent countless evenings helping with one thing or another. For the first time, I began to see something that had been invisible to me before. Not anger, not betrayal exactly, just a quiet pattern. In my parents' minds, my stability had never been something they wanted to protect. It had been something they relied on, and maybe they had relied on it for a very long time. I picked up my purse from the chair. Well, I said after a moment, keeping my voice steady, I just wanted to understand. Mom gave a small nod, relieved the conversation hadn't turned into an argument. Dad was already turning back toward the sink. As I stepped outside into the evening air, the thought returned that had first surfaced when I read the estate documents. For years, I had assumed I was helping build something secure for our whole family. But walking to my car that night, another possibility began to take shape. Maybe I hadn't been building a future for us. Maybe I had simply been maintaining one that was never meant to include me. The following Tuesday evening, I was finishing dinner when my phone rang. I had just set my plate in the sink and was rinsing it under warm water when the screen lit up on the counter. Mom. For a moment, I watched the phone vibrate where it sat. Nothing about the call itself was unusual. My mother called a few times a week, usually about small things, recipes. She wanted to try a sale she had found at the grocery store, or sometimes just to ask how work was going. But after the conversation we'd had the previous Wednesday, the name on the screen made something tighten quietly in my chest. I dried my hands and answered, "Hi, Mom." Her voice sounded exactly the way it always did, pleasant, conversational, as though we were picking up in the middle of an ordinary week. "Lauren, honey," she said, "I hope I didn't catch you at a bad time." "No, I just got home." "Well, good," she replied. "I just had a quick question." I leaned back against the counter, already sensing where the conversation might be heading, though she hadn't said anything yet. "You remember the mortgage payment is coming up this week, right?" she asked. There it was. For a second, neither of us said anything. I could hear the faint sound of the television in the background on her end of the line, probably the evening news that my parents watched almost every night. "Your father and I were looking over the bills earlier," she continued casually, "and we thought we should check with you about it." The way she said it made it sound routine, like confirming a dentist appointment, not like the conversation we had just days earlier about who the house would eventually belong to. I walked over to the kitchen table and sat down slowly. My purse was still there from earlier in the day. The edge of the small spiral notebook peeked out from the top. For years, this call would have ended one way. I would have said yes. I would have opened my banking app, transferred the money, and written another entry in the notebook before the night was over. But now, sitting at the table, something about the question landed differently. "Is everything else okay?" I asked. "Oh, yes," Mom said quickly. "Nothing unusual, just the regular payment." Her tone carried the same easy confidence it always had, as though the system we'd built together over the years was simply continuing the way it always had. Across the room, the refrigerator hummed quietly. I looked at the notebook again. 7 years of entries, numbers that represented moments when I had stepped in without hesitation. None of them had ever been connected to anything beyond the next bill that needed to be paid. Mom was still speaking. "You know how things have been lately," she said. "Your dad's been trying to keep up with everything, but some months are tighter than others." She wasn't pleading. She wasn't demanding. She was simply explaining the same pattern that had existed for years. And for the first time, I realized something about the way she framed it. In her mind, this wasn't asking for help, it was maintaining a system, one that everyone in the family had come to rely on, including her, including my father, maybe even Chloe. None of them seemed to think that anything had changed. Not the estate plan, not the conversation in the kitchen, not the quiet realization I had walked away with that night. To them, the structure of our family was still exactly the same. I rested my fingers on the edge of the notebook without opening it. "Okay," I said slowly. Mom sounded relieved, though I hadn't actually agreed to anything yet. "I knew you'd understand," she said warmly. But as the conversation wound down and we said goodbye, the thought that had been growing quietly since Wednesday returned again. For years, helping had felt like a choice. Now it was beginning to feel like an expectation. And expectations have a way of tightening around you without anyone noticing. I set the phone down on the table and sat there for a long moment staring at the notebook. The mortgage payment wasn't due for a few more days. But for the first time in 7 years, I realized I wasn't entirely sure what I was going to do when it was. The mortgage payment was due on Friday. I knew the exact date without checking the calendar. For years, the timing had been almost automatic. The first week of the month meant one thing in our family: someone had to make sure the house stayed afloat. Usually that someone was me. Thursday night after work, I sat at the small dining table in my apartment with my laptop open and the spiral notebook beside it. The same notebook I had been using for 7 years. Outside my window, traffic moved steadily along the main road, the soft hum of cars filling the quiet between passing headlights. Inside the apartment, everything felt unusually still. I flipped the notebook open. The pages were filled with small entries written in my own handwriting: mortgage April, water heater repair, groceries for mom, roof patch after storm. None of the entries were dramatic. Most were just numbers and short notes written quickly and forgotten after the transfer was complete. But looking at them that night, they didn't feel small anymore. They felt like a timeline, a quiet record of how responsibility had slowly settled into one place on me. My phone buzzed on the table, a message from my mother, just checking in about tomorrow's payment. "Let me know when you send it so we can confirm it cleared." I read the text twice. There was nothing emotional about it. No urgency, no apology, just the calm assumption that the process would continue the way it always had. For a moment, my instinct was the same one I had followed for years. Open the bank app, send the transfer, write the amount in the notebook. Problem solved. My hand even moved toward the laptop before stopping halfway across the table. The estate folder flashed through my mind again. The blue tab, the neat legal language, the line that said the house would eventually belong to Chloe. Not shared, not divided, given. I leaned back in the chair and let out a slow breath. Across the table, the notebook sat open like evidence of a story I had never fully examined until now. 7 years. 7 years of stepping in whenever something went wrong. Not once had I asked what any of it meant long term, and not once had anyone in my family offered that explanation. Another message appeared, this time from Chloe. "Mom said you're handling the mortgage again this month. Thanks." I stared at the screen. There was no sarcasm in the message, no hesitation, just the same quiet certainty everyone else seemed to share that this was how things worked. I realized something then that made the room feel suddenly smaller. If I sent the money again tonight, nothing would ever change. The system would reset. The house would stay afloat. My parents would keep relying on me. And someday, years down the road, the house I had helped maintain all that time would pass to someone else. Not because of a mistake, because that had always been the plan. I closed the notebook slowly. The sound of the spiral binding scraping the cover felt louder than it should have. For the first time since my parents' financial problems began, I didn't open my banking app. Instead, I picked up the phone. My mother answered on the second ring. "Hi, honey," she said warmly. "Did you get my message?" I did. I paused long enough that she noticed. "Well," she asked lightly. I looked down at the closed notebook under my hand. For years, helping had felt like the right thing to do. Family helped family. But somewhere along the way, helping had quietly turned into something else, expectation. An expectation, I realized, had been holding the entire structure together. "I'm not sending the payment this month," I said. The silence on the other end of the line was immediate. "What do you mean?" Mom asked. Her voice wasn't angry yet, just surprised. "I think it makes more sense for Chloe to start handling the mortgage," I said carefully. "Since the house is going to be hers." Another silence followed, longer this time. When Mom spoke again, the warmth was gone. "Lauren," she said slowly, "you're making this harder than it needs to be. Maybe." But sitting there at the table, I realized something that felt both unsettling and strangely clear. For years, I had been keeping the house standing. Tonight was the first time I stepped away. And once you step away from something like that, there's no quiet way to step back in. The first sign that something had actually changed came the following Monday morning. I was already at work when my phone buzzed on my desk. The dental clinic where I worked in Plano was quiet that hour, most of the patients scheduled later in the morning, and I was reviewing supply orders when the screen lit up. Dad. He rarely called during the day. I let it ring once before answering. "Hi, Dad." There was a short pause before he spoke. "Your mom said you didn't send the mortgage payment." The sentence was direct, almost mechanical, as though he were confirming a fact rather than starting a conversation. "That's right," I said. Another pause followed. On the other end of the line, I could hear faint sounds in the background, the television, the hum of the kitchen vent fan. "You know the due date was Friday," he said. "I know." His voice remained calm, but there was something under it now. Not anger exactly, something closer to disbelief. "That payment keeps the house current," he continued. "If we miss it, things start stacking up." I glanced through the glass wall of my office toward the reception desk. A hygienist was walking past with a patient chart, and the ordinary rhythm of the clinic continued without noticing the shift happening somewhere else in my life. "I understand that," I said. "Then I'm not sure what's going on here." For years, this was the moment when I would have reassured him. I would have said I'd take care of it. Instead, I leaned back in my chair. I told Mom the same thing I'm telling you, I said. If the house is going to Chloe, eventually she should probably start handling the mortgage. The silence that followed lasted longer this time. When Dad finally spoke again, his voice had changed. "That's not how families work." The sentence wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Across my desk sat the same spiral notebook I had brought to work that morning. I hadn't planned to bring it, but after Thursday night, I had slipped it into my bag almost automatically. 7 years of entries sat inside it. Mortgage payments, repairs, groceries, things I had handled without discussion. "I've been helping for a long time," I said carefully. "You've been helping because you're the one who can," he replied quickly. The words landed harder than he probably intended. Not cruel, just practical. "You're the stable one," he added. "Chloe's still figuring things out." I had heard that sentence in different forms for years, but hearing it now after seeing the estate documents, it sounded different. Less like reassurance, more like policy. "What happens if Chloe never figures it out?" I asked quietly. Dad didn't answer that. Instead, he shifted the conversation somewhere safer. "Look," he said, "your mother's already worried about the bills. Missing one payment isn't a good idea. I understand. Then send it over today, and we'll move on." The words were calm, almost reasonable, but there was an assumption underneath them, that this moment was temporary, that eventually the system would reset. I looked down at the notebook again. For years I had believed I was helping solve problems. Now I was beginning to see something else. The problems had never actually been solved, they had only been managed, and mostly by me. "I'm not sending it," I said. Dad exhaled slowly. You're making this bigger than it needs to be. Maybe, I said. Or maybe it's already been big for a long time. The line went quiet. Finally, he spoke again, more measured this time. We'll figure something out. The words sounded less certain than they probably meant to. When we hung up, I sat there for a moment staring at the phone. For the first time since I was in my 20s, the house in Plano wasn't resting on my shoulders anymore. And judging by the way my father had said those last words, my family was only just beginning to realize what that actually meant. By Thursday afternoon, the story had already started changing. I realized it when my phone rang while I was walking back to my car after work. The name on the screen surprised me, Mrs. Whitaker. She had been my parents' neighbor for almost 15 years. When I was younger, she had watched our house when my parents traveled, collected our mail during vacations, and occasionally brought over casseroles during the holidays. She wasn't someone who called me often. "Lauren, sweetheart," she said warmly when I answered. "I hope I'm not bothering you." "Not at all," I said, unlocking my car. "Well," she continued, her voice carrying that careful tone older neighbors sometimes use when they're not quite sure how to approach a sensitive subject. "I spoke with your mother yesterday." I paused halfway into the driver's seat. "Oh," she sounded very worried. Mrs. Whitaker hesitated for a moment. "She said the house payment didn't go through this month." I closed the car door slowly. "Yes," I said, "that's correct." "Well," she continued gently, "she mentioned you might be going through something. She said maybe work has been stressful or that things might be tight right now." The explanation hung in the air. I leaned my head back against the seat and stared through the windshield at the fading evening sky. So that was the story. Not that I had stepped away, not that the arrangement had changed, but that I was somehow unable to continue. "She seemed worried about you," Mrs. Whitaker added kindly. "I just thought I'd check in." For a moment, I considered correcting the story immediately, explaining everything, the estate documents, the conversation in the kitchen, the assumption that had carried our family for years. But something stopped me. Instead, I asked a simple question. "Did my mom mention Chloe?" There was a pause. "Well," Mrs. Whitaker said carefully, she said, "Chloe has been helping where she can." The phrasing was polite but vague. I knew what that usually meant. "Mrs. Whitaker," I said gently, "can I ask you something?" Of course, if someone helped pay a mortgage for 7 years, who would you expect to eventually inherit the house? There was a quiet laugh on the other end of the line. "Well, honey," she said, "I'd assume that person had some stake in it." I nodded slowly. "That's what I thought, too." The line went quiet. "You mean that's not the arrangement?" she asked. I didn't answer directly. I think my parents assumed I would keep helping because I always have. Mrs. Whitaker didn't say anything for a moment. Then she spoke in a tone that sounded both sympathetic and thoughtful. "Well," she said slowly, "that does change the way the situation sounds." I could almost hear her recalculating the version of events she had been told the day before. "I suppose families sometimes forget to look at things from the other side." "Sometimes," I said. After we said goodbye, I sat in the car for a moment longer. The interesting part wasn't the conversation itself. It was the realization that something had already started shifting. For years, the structure in our family had been invisible to everyone outside of it. Now, for the first time, someone else had seen the edges of it. Not because I had argued, not because I had tried to prove anything, but because the story no longer made sense once the missing pieces appeared. I started the car and pulled out of the parking lot. Across town, my parents were probably still explaining the situation the way they had always framed it. But the more people heard the details, the harder that explanation would be to maintain. And once a story stops holding together, it rarely goes back to the way it was. Saturday morning arrived quieter than I expected. No calls, no messages. After the conversation with Mrs. Whitaker on Thursday and the tense exchange with my father earlier that week, I had half expected the pressure to keep building. Instead, the silence felt almost deliberate. I was sitting at the kitchen table in my apartment, the spiral notebook open beside my coffee mug, when my phone buzzed again. This time it was a voicemail notification, not from my parents, from a number I didn't recognize. I pressed play. "Hello, Ms. Carter," the voice said professionally. This is Daniel Morales with North Texas Community Bank. I'm calling regarding the mortgage account for the property on Brookfield Drive. We've had some difficulty confirming the payment arrangement for this month. I sat up slightly. If you could return my call when you have a moment, we'd appreciate it. We're simply trying to clarify who will be handling the account moving forward. The message ended with the bank's callback number. For a moment, I stared at the phone in my hand. The bank. That hadn't happened before. In 7 years, the system had always been simple. My parents called. I sent the money. The payment went through. No one outside the family ever needed to know how the arrangement worked. But now the bank itself was asking questions, which meant something else had changed. I reached for the notebook. Flipping through the pages again, I noticed something I hadn't paid much attention to before. Every payment I had made was recorded the same way. Transfer sent from my account, confirmation number, date, but none of those payments were technically in my name. The mortgage itself had always remained under my parents' account. I had simply been feeding money into it from the outside. For years, that detail hadn't seemed important. Now it suddenly did, because it meant something very specific. Legally, the bank didn't see me as responsible for the loan, but they had clearly begun noticing that the person funding it might have changed. I leaned back in my chair, thinking. The silence from my parents suddenly made more sense. They were trying to patch the system, trying to keep the arrangement running long enough for things to settle down. Maybe Chloe had tried to step in. Maybe they had borrowed from somewhere else. Either way, the structure was wobbling. I called the number from the voicemail. A man answered after 2 rings. North Texas Community Bank, Daniel Morales speaking. "Hi," I said. "This is Lauren Carter. You left me a message about the Brookfield mortgage." "Yes, Ms. Carter. Thank you for calling back." His tone remained professional but careful. "We just wanted to confirm something," he said. "Historically, the payments have been coming from your account, but the loan itself belongs to your parents." "That's correct." "And we noticed the scheduled payment didn't come through this week." "Yes." He paused. "I want to make sure I'm speaking to the correct person," he said. "Are you still planning to manage the account going forward?" The question was neutral, but the answer suddenly mattered in a way it hadn't before. For a moment, I looked down at the notebook again. 7 years of quiet maintenance. 7 years of invisible support holding up a system that wasn't actually mine. "No," I said calmly. Another pause. "All right," Daniel said. "In that case, we'll need to confirm payment arrangements directly with the primary borrowers. That would be my parents." "Yes." His voice softened slightly, the way professionals sometimes do when they realize a situation inside a family might be changing. "We just want to make sure the account remains current." "I understand." After we ended the call, I sat at the table for a long moment. For the first time since everything had started unraveling, something felt different. Until now, I had been reacting, saying no, stepping away. But the conversation with the bank had revealed something important. The system my family depended on had always worked because I quietly held it together. Once I stepped out of that role, the structure had to reveal itself, not through arguments, not through accusations, just through the simple mechanics of reality. And reality, I realized, was about to start asking questions my family could no longer avoid. By the second week of May, the silence was gone for good. It came back in fragments at first. A missed call from my mother on a Tuesday afternoon, a text from Chloe that said only, "Call me when you can." Then another from my father later that evening. "We need to talk about the house." I didn't answer any of them right away. Not because I was trying to punish anyone. By then, I had learned that urgency in my family usually meant one thing. A problem had been ignored until it could no longer be hidden, and now someone expected me to absorb the impact. But this time, I already knew something they were only beginning to face. The system had changed, and it wasn't changing back. The clearest sign came 2 days later on Thursday evening when Mrs. Whitaker called again. Her voice was lower this time, more careful. "Lauren," she said, "I wasn't sure whether I should say anything, but I thought you'd hear it soon anyway." I sat down on my couch and waited. "There was a real estate agent's car in your parents' driveway this afternoon. I didn't speak, They were outside for a while, she continued, walking the property, taking notes. Your mother didn't look happy. I closed my eyes for a moment, not because I was shocked, because hearing it out loud made it real in a way nothing else had. The house on Brookfield Drive had always existed in two forms in my mind. There was the physical house, the brick exterior, the oak tree, the kitchen table where I had sorted bills and signed checks and tried to believe I was helping build something steady. And then there was the other version, the one my parents had created without saying it aloud. A future where the house would survive because I kept paying for it, but eventually belonged to Chloe. Now, for the first time, those two versions were colliding. Did your mother say anything? I asked. Only that things were more complicated than they expected, Mrs. Whitaker said. Then, after a pause, your sister was there too. She looked upset. Upset? The words settled strangely. Chloe had spent years floating around responsibility the way some people float through weather, aware of it only when it finally reaches them. Apparently, it had reached her now. After I hung up, I didn't move for a while. Then my phone buzzed again. This time it was Chloe. I opened the message. Mom and Dad are considering selling. This is getting serious. I stared at the screen. There was no accusation in the text, no sarcasm, no careless certainty like there had been before, just panic. A second message came through. They thought they had more time. That line stayed with me longer than I expected. More time for what? More time for me to change my mind. More time for the numbers to somehow stop mattering. More time for reality to remain negotiable. I set the phone down without replying. An hour later, Dad left a voicemail. His voice sounded tired but still controlled. We're exploring options, he said. The repairs, the missed payment, the balance. It's all adding up faster than we expected. He stopped there as if saying the facts out loud was already more than he wanted to do. Then came the part that mattered. We always thought the house would stay in the family. I listened to that sentence twice. Not we thought you deserved fairness. Not we handled this badly. Just that. The house would stay in the family. As if I had somehow moved outside that definition the moment I stopped financing it. By Friday morning, I heard the rest through the same quiet channels that had always carried family truths more honestly than family conversations ever did. The house wasn't just being discussed, it was being prepared to list. The overdue payment had started one problem, deferred repairs had exposed another. And without a reliable stream of money coming in from me, the math had finally stopped pretending. For years, I had been the difference between manageable and impossible. Now the difference was visible, and for the first time everyone could see it. I stood in my kitchen that night with the old spiral notebook in my hands, page after page of amounts, dates, confirmations, a private record of everything that had been quietly holding up a future I was never meant to be part of. The strange thing was, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clear. This wasn't revenge in the dramatic way people imagine it. No shouting, no scenes, no public humiliation, just consequence. Simple, slow, undeniable consequence. And by then it had already started moving faster than any of them could control. The only question left was how much it would take before they finally understood what they had built and who had been carrying it all along. The house on Brookfield Drive officially went on the market 3 weeks later. I didn't hear it from my parents. I heard it the same way I had heard everything else that mattered during those weeks, quietly through the same neighborhood network that had always carried the truth a little faster than family conversations ever did. Mrs. Whitaker sent a short message on a Tuesday afternoon. The sign went up this morning. I looked at the message for a moment before opening the listing online. The photos were familiar in a strange way, the oak tree in the front yard, the brick walkway my father had repaired twice over the years, the kitchen where I had once spent hours sorting through bills and paperwork while believing I was protecting something that belonged to all of us. Now it looked like any other property listing, clean, neutral, ready for someone else. I closed the page after a few seconds. Later that evening, my father called. His voice sounded older than I remembered. We accepted an offer today, he said. He didn't try to dress the news up as anything else. The repairs were more expensive than we thought, he continued. And once the payments started slipping, the bank wasn't willing to keep extending things. I didn't interrupt. There was a long pause before he spoke again. "You weren't wrong," he said quietly. Those 4 words landed heavier than any apology might have. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Then he added something else. "We should have handled things differently. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. Just honest." In the background, I could hear my mother moving somewhere in the house that was no longer going to be theirs much longer. "And Chloe?" I asked. "She's looking for a place with a roommate," he said. His voice carried a kind of reluctant acceptance. For the first time, I think she understands what things actually cost. When we ended the call, I sat in my apartment for a long time. Outside my window, the same steady traffic moved through the evening the way it always did. Life hadn't changed in the dramatic way people sometimes imagine revenge stories ending. No one had lost everything. No one had been publicly humiliated, but something fundamental had shifted. For years, my role in the family had been invisible. I was the quiet solution to problems that no one wanted to examine too closely. The stable one, the reliable one, the one who would step in. Stepping away hadn't destroyed anything. It had simply revealed the truth that had always been there. The house hadn't been lost because I stopped helping. It had been unsustainable long before that. I just stopped pretending otherwise. A week later, I opened the spiral notebook one last time. Page after page of numbers. 7 years of transfers. 7 years of trying to keep something balanced that had never really been fair. I tore out the last blank page and closed the cover. Then I placed the notebook in a drawer, not because the past didn't matter, but because it no longer needed to follow me forward. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive as a dramatic moment. Sometimes it arrives quietly in the form of clarity, the kind that lets you step out of a story that was never meant to belong to you. And for the first time in years, my life finally felt like it was entirely my own. If this story made you think about fairness, family, or the quiet ways people carry responsibility, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Feel free to share your perspective in the comments. And if you enjoy stories like this, consider liking the video and following along for the next one.